just at the highest level, who are we? Red Hat is a company that has been focused on the enterprise. We are over 20 years old, and the focus of our customer base is the large scale enterprise. So you see on the left there that we're serving more than 90% of the Fortune 500. That's really just to give you a sense of who we are talking to on a daily basis. We're about 15,000 people spread globally around the world. And the thing that we're particularly proud of is we became the first company to hit a $3 billion revenue mark, building everything from open source. So to begin with, software companies at that scale, there aren't a lot of those, but specifically software companies at that scale delivering software built from open source technologies, there's exactly one, which is something that we're extremely proud of. So we hit the annual revenue rate of $3 billion. We're seeing more like quarterly $1 billion revenue. So this is just an exciting thing and a really huge acknowledgement of the value of community development. So something that I just wanted to highlight, Red Hat is associated with open source commonly, so you can see what it means at a commercial context. And then when you take that together, who we are, who we serve, that led to the historic acquisition of IBM acquiring Red Hat for $34 billion. And the thing that I think is amazing about this is, one, again, huge acknowledgement of the value and impact of open source on the industry at large. And it's all about the people, the process that Red Hat follows, because we're not a company that has IP. So that acquisition represents an engagement process with customers, a set of products built from open source, and the people who are Red Hatters. So for us, really exciting last year specifically, but even going back, I've been at Red Hat for just about 15 years. And it's always a dynamic and exciting place because we sort of sit within communities which are leading the edge of technology development. I just wanted to give you a little glimpse of the high-level view of what our process looks like. So what you see here is in the center of this slide is representing a large number of open source software projects. We are an enterprise software company. We develop everything using an open source development model. And what you see is as you spread out from that center of all those open source projects, you see what we would call community distributions. If you're a Linux person, you'd be familiar with something like Fedora. That's what I'm running right now. Fedora 32 just came out. I've been on the Fedora 32 beta leading up to our big event this week, which is Red Hat Summit, doing a lot of video recording, and miraculously, despite being beta, everything just worked. Knock on wood, setting myself up there. But if you look at that picture, we start in the center with the open source projects. We curate that in combined software projects into distributions that are community focused. And then ultimately, we deliver those as commercial products to our customer base. And you can see the product names on the far left and far right. It's just an example of a set of some of our products. And the important thing to note is everything that we do is centered around open source and open source development. And we're engaging with the community at every level. So in the core project, in some curated content, and then all the way out representing, bringing customers into this picture, representing their needs into the community through commercial products. Now, one thing that I like to highlight, again, we've been focused on open source since our inception. One thing that I like to highlight is if you look at open source today, it is a far cry from the early days where it really felt like a fringe radical movement. And today, open source is really a mainstream way of doing software development, to the degree that I assert that open source is the innovation engine for the industry. I'm showing here just some statistics that are pulled from GitHub. And you can see there's over 100 million Git repositories. Now, I understand that there's forks, and not every single repository is a representation of a standalone project, but it just gives you a sense of the magnitude of activity. That activity is being contributed to by over 40 million developers, which represent over 2 million businesses and organizations. And this is just GitHub. GitHub is a large place where open source development happens. It's not the only place, but it just gives you a sense of the sheer scale of what happens in open source communities. And then when you consider leading edge technologies, things like AI and machine learning, or what we'll be talking about today, container platforms and container orchestration, these are technologies where the leading edge is in the open source community. So in the early days of open source, we certainly had a lot of technology development that was taking the lead from proprietary software products. Today, that's sort of flipped around, and while we do see commoditization as an outcome associated with open source, innovation is increasingly the important part of the open source communities at large. What's important in the context of Red Hat is we're tapping into all of this innovation and looking for ways to harness that energy, that enthusiasm, that creativity, and bring it into our enterprise customer base. So enterprise customers, look at open source as a way to tap into innovation, but also there's some trepidation. Not everybody has the skills and capabilities of jumping right into an open source community. So we're there to help create, sometimes I describe it as help bridge that impedance mismatch, which I'll talk about a little bit more later this morning. So again, I think it's important to say open source is the innovation engine for the industry. We're in the middle of it all, and we're bringing that innovation into the enterprise. So as I was alluding to before, open source is kind of this leading edge technology development environment. And enterprise companies, well, they're enterprises. They have a business to run. They're really looking at finding a balance between keeping the lights on with all of the investments that they've made to date. Typically, this is multiple decades of investments in technology. I often sort of make fun of the enterprise data center as a place for software archaeologists to explore and find at least one copy of everything that's ever been created by software vendors. And it's only, I'm only half kidding. There's some real truth to that. When you go into the enterprise data center, there's a long history of differing eras of technology. It's all combined together. And what's really critical when you think of it from the perspective of the enterprise, this is what's running their business. This is decades of investment potentially in building up what is managing every single transaction, managing connections to customers. And it's not something that any enterprise takes lightly. These are mission critical workloads. Now, having said that, the world is changing. It's changing rapidly. You hear all the buzzwords, digital transformation, this and that. The need to keep up with market demands for any enterprise is only speeding up and increasing. And so they're looking at this sort of challenge. How do we maintain what we've built, modernize where that makes sense, and innovate and bring new technologies into the enterprise in a way that's not either destabilizing or just cost prohibitive? So, this is the balance that I think customers are looking for. And again, from that impedance mismatch point of view, this is where Red Hat plays. We're in the middle. We really understand the enterprise customer. We've been working, building stability, building performance, building reliability, feeding security updates through consistent update streams. This is sort of the bread and butter of what it means to serve the enterprise, while we also sit in these open source communities. We have thousands of developers who spend their entire days working in open source community projects, bringing that technology into our product portfolio and delivering that stably, reliably into the enterprise. And if you listen to analysts, you might hear words like mode 1, mode 2, or different ways of describing the traditional enterprise data center and sort of the next generation, where things are going. I think it's important for our customer base to really find a path forward. And it's even more important today where we're working from home. There's questions around what's happening in the economy, focusing on building an optimized, stable infrastructure to really look at the cost of managing that infrastructure. We've done some surveys across the customer base and seen that if you consider the combination of existing data center investments, some SaaS services, and third-party ISV software procurement, that typically represents on the order of 70% of an IT budget, which means the vast majority of the IT budget is going to keeping the lights on, leaving 30% for doing net new development. And when you consider that pace of change broadly in the market, the question on most IT leaders' minds is how can we sort of maximize that developer velocity without compromising stability? And that's something that we try to bring build this bridge between today's world, help optimize that, which frees up resources to invest in building forward into more dynamic development environments, which typically look like cloud-like environments, with whether it's literally the public cloud, whether it's spanning a hybrid cloud. That developer velocity and ultimately ability to quickly bring things into the market to address a new market opportunity is critical to the enterprise customer base. So our core strategy is what we call open hybrid cloud. I'll go into the details of that in a moment, but at a high level, the open hybrid cloud for us sort of breaks down into three key areas. So when you look at our software portfolio or our product portfolio, we focus in areas of hybrid cloud infrastructure, so kind of the lower levels of the stack. We focus in areas of cloud native development. So how can you build these sort of next generation distributed services built with in containers, surfacing as smaller services, whether it's a microservices based software architecture or the beginnings of breaking down a monolith into some smaller pieces without going all the way to the extreme. There's a whole spectrum that's possible there. Leveraging tools like CI/CD to rapidly move software from a source code repository into production. That's a focus area for us in what we would call cloud native development. And then across the application and infrastructure layers, we look at management and automation. So how can we improve the efficiency of running all of your infrastructure and your applications? So those are the main three areas that we break the open hybrid cloud into in terms of our portfolio. And this is kind of an eye chart giving you some visibility into the breadth of our portfolio. So the red box represents that hybrid cloud infrastructure that I mentioned before. And you see things like Red Hat Enterprise Linux, kind of at the foundation of everything, OpenStack, storage, Red Hat virtualization, a number of what you might consider infrastructure layer projects and products. And then if you go up a little higher in that stack, you see Red Hat OpenShift, which is really going to be the focal point for the bulk of this conversation today. Red Hat OpenShift, interestingly, sits in both the infrastructure side, Kubernetes providing that low-level infrastructure, giving applications access to compute, networking, storage. But it's also very application-centric. So you can kind of think of it as being the application platform. So it sort of sits in that middle zone. The upper green box is all about our middleware and developer tools focused on things like integration, process automation, a set of runtimes and development tools that give developers just the velocity they need the tool set they need to improve their velocity. And then off on the left-hand side, you see a set of automation and management tools bringing a variety of capabilities spanning that entire stack, including Red Hat Insights, where we actually collect information from deployed systems and from our customer base, use that information to develop an understanding of how software is used across the industry, and then feedback recommendations to our customers when they are running in, say, a non-standard way, or more simply just running something that's out of date, needs to be updated. We can even automate the process of discovery and remediation. So some interesting tools in there. In the very center, you see Red Hat Advanced Cluster Management for Kubernetes. It's on the topic list for today. It's very Kubernetes focused, which is why we put it associated with OpenShift, but it is a management tool that's bringing a set of policy management by policy capabilities that I think are really critical for efficient management of both applications and infrastructure for the enterprise. So to zoom out a little bit, the Open Hybrid Cloud is, for us, it's the platform that spans all of these different deployment environments, whether it's in your enterprise data center, on premises, deployed directly to bare metal, whether it's virtualized in a software-defined data center or virtualized data center, whether it's in a private cloud or out spanning multiple public clouds, or increasingly today, all the way out to what you might call an edge cloud. Our platform, which is largely built from the underlying Linux capabilities, which provide the low-level hardware enablement, whether it's physical or virtual, provide the primitives needed to create isolation between applications, and of course provide an application runtime environment, combined with Kubernetes and Red Hat OpenShift, gives this platform that can deploy in any of these environments and builds total consistency. So from an application development point of view, from an operational point of view, you have the same platform spanning all these different deployment footprints, giving a set of capabilities that allow you to build services, modern applications that are surfacing as a set of services, leveraging all of the enthusiasm and mind share around containers, bringing, from a commercial point of view, bringing together a whole set of ISVs to build out this open hybrid cloud platform.
I have a question here, and it's about competition. I mean, now that you have laid out this strategy, which is not totally new. I mean, you were talking about this thing for a while now. So, right. Who really are your competitors? I mean, do you think that now you see the competition more from the cloud providers that have part of this stack and they are building to realize this hybrid cloud, so an extension of their cloud ecosystem to be directly in the on-premises data center? Or do you see companies like Microsoft, okay, the traditional Microsoft, not Microsoft Azure, that is going towards the other direction? So it's more like you with all the components now building this hybrid cloud scenario. So or a little bit of everything. I mean,
well, it's a good question. It's a common question that we hear, and towards the end of the day, Brian will go into some of the kind of details of the competitive landscape. But at a high level, if the modern world is a combination of partnering and complementary solutions and competitiveness, and the cheesy buzzword is co-opetition. And so when you look at the public cloud providers have a Kubernetes service. They are all, initially, the public cloud providers were very big on everything's moving to the public cloud. If you go to the enterprise, even the enterprises that have an all-in mantra for the public cloud, they tend to have some challenges getting the entirety of their enterprise software suite onto the public cloud. Typically, the way I usually describe it is common pattern: 2,500 enterprise applications. The first 25 go smoothly. You hit the 26th one, it's pretty rough. It's usually stateful. doesn't fit well the cloud model, and often the path onto the cloud stops right there, doesn't just slow down. So the public clouds are all embracing a hybrid model. Take Azure as a concrete example. Azure provides a native service called AKS. They also provide a managed service called ARO, which is Azure Red Hat OpenShift service. And so that managed service is Red Hat OpenShift sitting on Azure, and made available to the broad customer base through Microsoft directly. So I think that's a great example of that kind of co-opetition. AKS, useful in it's pretty stripped down. It's very Kubernetes focused. It doesn't have the whole breadth of tooling around it, so that from an enterprise application perspective, something like OpenShift is really a critical tool for addressing enterprise needs. AKS is a way to kind of get developers quickly playing with Kubernetes, but it doesn't necessarily translate directly to large-scale enterprise adoption. And that's something that we see consistently across the public clouds. So, there's a world where we run on all the public clouds. We have commercial relationships with the public clouds. We also compete at that Kubernetes service level. And then they're adopting a hybrid cloud model, which is what we've been talking about and building towards for 5-7 years now. So, I think the competitive dynamic in that context is there's competition between us and the public clouds. And also there's a set of enterprise software companies that deliver more to the traditional enterprise that themselves are branding hybrid and talking about the combination of virtualization and bringing in Kubernetes as an application platform. To bring it to this slide, what's consistent across all of these different either partners or competitors in the market, broadly, I think we've agreed as an industry that Kubernetes is a critical technology project. The value that Linux has brought to the industry is measured in billions and billions of dollars. But more specifically, the value is coming from the fact that everybody has seen this as a useful piece of infrastructure and has sort of standardized around it. Kubernetes is bringing that same kind of standardization from an operating system perspective to a distributed systems perspective. And so I think that's why we see all the clouds providing Kubernetes services. Lots of companies, whether they're startups or traditional enterprise vendors, selling some form of Kubernetes attached to their platform. And it means, for us, the competitive nature is always changing. But at an industry level, we're agreeing on this being a critical platform or critical software project. And the value that brings broadly to the enterprise is an expectation, understanding that the investments are here for the long term. Linux is over 25 years old. It continues to refine and grow. Over the course of 3 years, about a third of the code base is still being rewritten. Kubernetes is a lot newer. Over that same 3-year period, about 95% of the code base is being rewritten. So under massive amounts of development, but really all with an eye towards building this abstraction layer that allows things on top to evolve and allows things below to evolve, and maintaining Kubernetes as that stable distributed systems layer. So I think it's why we're so excited. It's why we got involved in the very beginning and helped Google bring it out into the open source community.
So this is Keith Townsend. Follow-up question to Enrique's question about branding. I still get this question to this date because OpenShift as a brand predates Kubernetes.
That's true.
Can you help me? And even if I go to Red Hat site today, there's tools, there's forums, there's talk about how I move an OpenShift application built on OpenShift from the previous underlay to a modern container-based underlay based on Kubernetes. Talk to us about the brand OpenShift. When I'm making a commitment to open source and to Red Hat OpenShift product, is the commitment to Kubernetes or is the commitment to OpenShift?
Also a great question, and something I don't want to steal the thunder of the later presenters. And I know Derek has some content that really goes straight into this. I'll give kind of a high level. OpenShift, one, you're absolutely right. It predates Kubernetes. So we had a V1, a V2, and now we're up to V4. Starting with V3, we introduced Kubernetes. For us, that was a huge bet, major shift in the underlying implementation. Concepts roughly similar in terms of what are now known as today as Linux containers, but at the time we had these notions of gears and cartridges, and an orchestration tier, which was homespun in V2, and now we're using Kubernetes to move images and schedule images. But OpenShift is a platform that is built on Kubernetes. It's also directly integrated into that is Linux. So the notion that Kubernetes has to leverage an underlying worker node or a host to do work, that's something that we bring together and tightly engineer so that the relationship and lifecycle cadence between the Kubernetes layer and the underlying operating system are well understood. And then Kubernetes itself, there was a presentation at a KubeCon probably 3 years ago at this point that tried to draw the analogy of Kubernetes being like the Linux kernel to a full distribution. So Kubernetes just being a critical and core technology, but in order to really leverage, you don't just deploy Linux as a kernel, you deploy Linux plus an entire operating system around it to leverage the underlying kernel. So if you look at OpenShift, there's additional tools for logging and monitoring and CI/CD pipelines and identity management and all these different pieces that aren't actually a part of the core of the Kubernetes platform. So Red Hat OpenShift as a brand is a distribution of Kubernetes made accessible to the enterprise by bringing together all the different distribution components you need to make Kubernetes, the sort of kernel, useful and accessible. So it's very much Kubernetes. And in fact, if you look at our workflows, a lot of our examples show some higher level interfaces, CLI, or interfaces that talk about OpenShift as a command line, but inside is Kubernetes. So if you want to think of it in terms of how you could intersect as a developer, the Kubernetes underneath, you could do that furthest away and treat it like a PaaS platform using your source code repository and Git hooks to just trigger a CI pipeline that will build your applications, containerize your applications, put them into containers, and then deliver that onto the OpenShift platform.
So we can get into this later in Brian's presentation or one of the other presentations. But what I would like to hear today is the commitment of OpenShift to Kubernetes moving forward. Because if I committed to OpenShift 5 years ago and you guys found a better approach, which is Kubernetes, I can't argue that. If I'm relying on OpenShift as my Kubernetes distribution without using all of that goodness that you guys are providing as a PaaS, and 5 years from now, OpenShift as a product decides that some other orchestrator or some other kernel is a better way to provide that PaaS layer, which you guys did. So historically, you have decided that one way was the right way. Now another way is the modern way. 5 years from now, especially as you're dealing with enterprise customers, how do I know there's a commitment to Kubernetes as a brand when it comes to OpenShift is something that I'd like to dig into later on in the day.
Okay, yeah, I mean, we are all in on Kubernetes. We are the largest enterprise distribution commercially. We're the early co-developer helping Google bring it out into the open source community. We're the number 2 contributor to the project. It is a huge focal point for us. OpenShift is a Kubernetes distribution, and over the fullness of time, what is the right underlying technologies is always an open question. So it's really hard to just pin those things down. Linux has been a clear focal point for the industry, and we've been deeply invested in that. Kubernetes is emerging as another clear focal point for the industry, and we're deeply invested in that. So that notion, I would put these as synonymous. We are, from a branding perspective, we are a certified Kubernetes distribution from the CNCF conformance test suite perspective. We track very directly the open source release process and map that directly to our product releases. So it is a huge focal point for us. And we're in the mix helping define things like the OCI standards to make sure we understand what images or what image compatibility looks like, tools for building, developing different kinds of images. That all of that is a part of our world and reflected in OpenShift as being 100% built around Kubernetes and Linux. I'll just quickly zip through this. This is just giving you some vision of the types of applications that our enterprises are being more interested in as they roll forward. So they got that stability world. They're building net new applications. Those applications, broadly speaking, cloud native. A great example would be AI and machine learning as next generation applications. And we've done quite a bit of work trying to make the data science workflow accessible to a broad set of developers in an open source project that we've launched called Open Data Hub, where we bring together a set of technologies and even include our certified ISV ecosystem in that project so that you can quickly share ideas, refine models, and then integrate those into applications. So you could build a model, surface it with a REST API, and integrate that REST API for inference into your application and deliver a quote unquote smart application or intelligent application. And increasingly, we have a lot of conversations with our customers about bringing this all the way out to the edge. And a lot of the applications that we talk about with our customers in this context are data-driven, machine learning-based edge applications. So kind of this broad view of where Red Hat OpenShift fits the role of this open hybrid cloud core platform. If you think of a cloud, which we were talking about earlier, I think a cloud provides two key features. One is operational efficiency. So if you look at a cloud, it's a managed service. Somebody else is running it for you. That's like infinitely efficient. Two, increased developer velocity. And that developer velocity is about having a breadth of capabilities accessible as APIs, easily onboarded into your application. If you look at operational efficiency, the traditional enterprise is about 100 times less efficient than a hyperscaler at managing a single server. So our focus is on bridging that gap and reducing the cost of running infrastructure within the enterprise. And then looking at the enterprise, the faster you can build and deliver software, that is directly associated with revenue growth. So we did participate in a study with McKinsey where they showed that a higher developer velocity index correlates to 5 times faster revenue growth. So it's just a clear way to say our focus is building developer velocity. Our goal is to enable developers to just, every line of code is business value. And on the operational side, establish high-level policies where the system itself is autonomous and can manage the details, the make it so part of that policy. That's sort of the aspirational direction. We're very well on that path and helping reduce the cost of operational infrastructure and accelerate the speed of development. I think as we move forward in time, that operational efficiency and developer velocity needs to span a highly distributed environment, inclusive of the edge. So multi-cluster management, what we'll talk about with ACM, is critical. That's data as a central actor, also critical. And then the events associated with recognizing something in the data, whether it's an anomaly or whether it's a pattern match, that event becomes a trigger for serverless functions. That model of event-driven function as a service-oriented programming, highly efficient, allows developers to focus just on the key business logic And that's just a view into the future of where OpenShift is going as this open hybrid cloud platform, distributed out to the edge, supporting a variety of workloads and enabling developer velocity. I will skip to this last slide because it's a major eye chart. This is really what we're building. It's open in every way. We have an open ecosystem. We built from open source. We embrace open standards. It's hybrid across all of those different footprints. And it's a cloud, meaning it gives that operational efficiency. It creates developer velocity. And we'll talk later about the details of things like bringing a service mesh or bringing a function as a service serverless environment, supporting AI and ML, being connected to our customers so that we can gather data, use that data to develop models to further improve the operational efficiency of this infrastructure, automate the patching and lifecycle management through operators as a technology that codifies the SRE and the smarts of an SRE into code that can help manage and support highly efficient operational environments, and all the telemetry associated with that,